You got me captured, I'm under your spell. I guess I'll never learn. I have your picture, yes, I know it well. Another page is turned. Are you for real? It's so hard to tell from just a magazine. Yeah, you just smile and the picture sells. Look what that does to me. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. So something I've bagged on about before in the past with this series is how much I absolutely love going to the movies, and whenever I have the chance to not just see like one movie a week, but to pack in two for like a whole double feature. And just how awesome it can be when you're just sort of leaping into two movies that, even if you're not choosing them based on them being in like the same genre, I won't just double feature horror movies and genre flicks, I'll double feature anything. And when those two movies you aren't necessarily aware if they're in the same genre or even about the same or similar things in terms of their stories, but you find something that resonates or is in a dialogue between both of them that sort of has a serendipity, that's something I really crave and look out for in my ongoing personal journey with the art of cinema. And boy howdy did I have a crash course in that sort of serendipity this last Thursday. Around about August and into September, the deck really does clear for a lot of smaller movies at even the more chain and Main Street multiplexes. We've long since gotten a lot of the hot ticket items from the majors out of the way in June and July, and quite frankly speaking, even a lot of boutique distributors of more independent and international film productions, even they tend to not release their top-line festival pickups and awards bait around this part of the year. And one of those films that snuck in under the radar as we sort of take that stride from summer into autumn was something called Lurker, a psychological thriller which marks a debut for one Alex Russell as a writer-director, and is seeing its limited theatrical push handled by none other than Mubi, the art house streaming service that in the past few years has been increasingly pushing into film production and distribution. Lurker stars Theodore Pellerin as Matthew, a nondescript 20-something living in LA with his grandmother. Matt works in a retail store that caters hipster fashion and has a reputation for attracting up-and-coming celebrities, among whom is included a synth-wavy pop singer who goes simply by Oliver. He's played by Archie Madekwe. Feigning ignorance of Oliver's identity, Matthew exploits one of his arrivals at the store to play an old-school soul track that he seems eerily confident Oliver will both recognize and love, identifying it with a deep influence of his childhood and on his music. This works like a charm, and Oliver becomes so taken with Matt's music choice that he puts him on a backstage VIP list for an upcoming show that he's playing. From the beginning, Matt's at first clearly one-sided attraction to Oliver seems to have a tad less to do with music and more to do with some parasocial obsession, with Pellerin's performance and even Madekwe's flirty feedback to the former staccato, nervous performance of the sort of person who should belong right inside this young tastemaker's entourage. The chemistry between them seems to be more than homosocial, like the cool bad boy courting some immature geek, and certainly more than the parasocial, with the same terminally online, in this case temporarily embarrassed, multi-hyphenate tastemaker and micro-celebrity that buttresses so much of the deluge of short-form and superficial content that our social network-based pop culture economy produces so much of. This guy who sees himself as a temporarily embarrassed, fated person to rise to the top of that ecosystem. He in turn reads way too much into the slightest sense of affirmation from this at most C-tier singer who he doesn't really know very well. The chemistry that Pellerin and Madekwe inflect into their performances goes beyond this and suggests something veritably parasexual, just the way Matthew looks not merely at, but upon Oliver, and more importantly, the way that Oliver looks back at him and talks in such a crushed, syrupy, downright seductive voice. There is, as the kids say, something a little sus from the get-go about the interplay between these two characters, which of course from the beginning underscores Matt's attempts to attract Oliver's attention with an air of slippery untrustworthiness. This in turn ends up foreshadowing what will turn out to be a long, sordid journey through Matt's eyes, in which writer-director Alex Russell seems to absolutely luxuriate in giving us just enough scraps of detail into Matthew's home life with his grandmother and his attitude of just seemingly autistic innocence in not seeming to be able to grasp and only ever mimic what he expects social norms to be. Russell gives us just enough crumbs of this stuff as Matt continues to find himself ever more deterministically absorbed into Oliver's world, and not without considerable embarrassment and indignity to himself, as he basically is just casually accepted as less a potential friend as an unpaid intern in Oliver's hype house, cleaning up after the messes of these always busy but never seemingly that productive artistes. We get just enough for Russell to kindle just the faintest light of sympathy for Matt's position in this scenario, almost leading one to wonder if Lurker might end up being something like a SoCal Gen Z twist on Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, with the eponymous Lurker in the form of Matt, framed at first as the kind of person who is either a total cynic or just too ignorant about life and the world to know what a cynic he truly is, but to play the part and cozy up to the favor of his benefactors just enough that he becomes a ticking time bomb in Oliver's life, all of Oliver's superficiality and cynicism incarnated and ready to blow up in his own face as a kind of post-romantic punishment. But while Lurker never quite loses that slight suggestion of counterintuitive dynamic, one where Matt really is the sympathetic, down-on-his-luck character and Oliver is merely reaping the eternal reward for his own exploitation of others, or at least a vastly unequal system in which everybody is in competition with everybody else for everybody's attention. Russell has a tendency, especially in the first half of the film, to give us more sensitive moments with Matt, moments that truly do seem to gesture to a human core to this character, only to quite violently and starkly jerk us back, not simply foreshadowing, but toying with our early hopes before proceeding to morbidly play out what, frankly, turns out to be a fairly derivative example of a subgenre of the psychological thriller that goes back to Patricia Highsmith's Tom Ripley character and travails all the way up through Martin Scorsese's The King of Comedy, to Hal Ashby and Jerzy Kosinski's Being There, to the recent past with such standout films as Joel Patrikas's Buzzard, and especially in terms of what seems to be guiding both Russell's literary and visual influences, Dan Gilroy's Nightcrawler. Lurker is not so much a post-romantic drama about karmic punishment as it is an allegorical, satirical psychopath story. You know what I mean. The kind of movie that follows an often socially maladroit but otherwise completely cynical anti-hero, completely devoid of empathy for other human beings and seemingly only capable of obsession, greed, and manipulation. But where those tendencies of the psychopath as constructed in popular culture are framed against a satirical backdrop that points to aspects of contemporary society, in this case our engagement-driven pop culture ecosystem, in which those constructed qualities of a psychopath, impulsivity and hedonism, grandiose visions of oneself, shallow affect and glib charm, and especially a parasitic relationship with others, seems to describe endemic features of that media ecosystem or contemporary society in general so fittingly. There's certainly a lot of juicy and some downright ingenious aspects of how Lurker plays out for any connoisseur of psychological thrillers to really sink their teeth into, and when it comes to performances, Russell certainly has a great ensemble around which to tighten what turns out to be an at least exceptional vehicle for evoking the strangely cathartic joys of just feeling oneself being stressed out through a whole movie. Lurker certainly feels a lot longer than it actually is, but in a good way. And it turned out to be such a technically accomplished debut that, frankly, my opinion of it was far more glowing immediately after leaving the theater than it was, ironically, within minutes of seeing the next feature on my impromptu double bill for last weekend. And that's what the serendipity of the double feature can do for you. Sometimes you'll get really lucky having at least two pretty good movies to trace your evening by, but there is sometimes this other potential for thinking you just saw a really good movie only to see another movie right after it that you are not expecting to be even remotely similar in terms of its plot or to explore similar themes or psychological terrain at all, but then turns out to blow the first one completely out of the water. Lurker is certainly an exceptional debut. I'm prepared to give it a decent 3.5 out of 5 for all that it does right, but I'm afraid that I am going to have to knock it, if only because I think, not unlike Hurry Up Tomorrow, another of these kind of psychological dramas from this year that I appreciated quite a lot and explored similar territory of the kind of culture of obsession and self-serving that is inflamed in our current environment of engagement farming pop culture. Lurker is kind of the victim of living in its own hermetic shadow. Russell isn't even coming to this project with the level of success and ego that Abel Tesfaye did with Hurry Up Tomorrow. So as a consequence, Lurker feels, on the one hand, so much more pat and so much less revealing about its subject and its character study, while held back by the same exact factors. Lurker, while a technically very accomplished film, feels immediately far less substantial the farther you step away from it and realize that the only way it has of relating to or satirizing this amorphous pop culture swamp in which just about everyone seems to be chasing clout and validation in the most unhealthy and backbiting and exploitative ways, almost like our very digital lives have engineered an entire generation of Tom Ripleys or Chance the Gardeners, it still works kind of like being there in a hype house. But Russell's vision is still entombed within a satirical framework that is just as distracted by the surface level patina of fame or infamy, the hollow binary between those who have made it in this economy of fly-by-night success for social media slop, and those who can only copy and obsess over their betters in this pandemonium. But I'm sorry, just like how the best thing about Hurry Up Tomorrow is how efficaciously Tesfaye works through his own massive ego to fully and finally dispel the notion that the reverberations that popular art can have with an audience basically says nothing about the emotional or psychological depth of the person who creates it. The most lackluster aspect of Lurker is that it's yet another of these films trying to describe the perdition of today's wild youth that fails to account for the sometimes just as utterly absurd and indeed sometimes far more horrifying ways that these hipster impresarios and hype house landlords and clickbait tyrants ultimately tell on themselves when push comes to shove. Like, a lot of this can be affected by simply what tranche of the algorithm slots you're being put into, but there was a moment where I was just getting slammed on YouTube and Facebook with these short-form content videos that are all about not pop stars or pranksters or gaming streamers, but this group of 20-somethings who would go to college campuses that they clearly researched ahead of time based on their reputations as party schools and would just randomly stop scantily clad girls to try to flirt with them. Sometimes they'd do prank stuff, but it mostly seemed to be a kind of pickup artistry confidence school for men. Like, look, here's how easy it is to fake being confident and charming just long enough to get a girl's number and not come off like a total creep. Anyway, the last time I ever heard about that said channel, the creator and owner of it was basically having to explain that, like, he had to cut all ties with one of his regular co-creators because it turned out he was suffering from pretty severe paranoid schizophrenia and had stopped taking his medication. And then there was another guy who it turned out was never really their friend and had basically been a rich boy who bought his way into their group only to prove that he actually was kind of desperately secretly a creep that they were trying to avoid promoting? I mean, look, besides the worst case scenarios of like dudes like Stephen Crowder basically being alleged to have created an environment of rampant sexual harassment behind the scenes of his program, or even the Hawk Tuah girl who, like, didn't she basically have to go into hiding or something because she did a crypto partnership that fleeced her fans and she was getting just an avalanche of actionable death threats and doxing or whatever? There's clearly so much to the seedy underbelly of the social media age that is, on the one hand, so much more mundane in our expectations of how these micro celebrities rise up and then fall off, but then sometimes so much simpler and top down in terms of how they oppress and exploit others under the guise of camaraderie and shared values. The deal is that the more terminally online you are, the more likely it is for the themes of Lurker to not only not be terribly resonant for you, but for what technical success it does have to be fairly fleeting, because, like, you know that this sort of Tom Ripley scenario with Matt seeking out Oliver, you know that that's not only not really what happens, but that's more often a phantom that a lot of these real creeps and useful idiots in the slot machine hellscape want you to think is the problem. It's the fake friends and stans and haters. It's not, the internship as a new form of indentured servitude. Which brings us safely to our second half of this double feature with Twinless, a movie I knew absolutely nothing about going into it. I'm not even sure how it ended up on my watch list, other than it must have been waiting there after I spotted it getting some good buzz at one of the various East Coast film festivals. I decided to go into this one completely blind, and this is part of where, as a film critic, I find myself in the awkward position of potentially having to spoil that sort of blind watching experience. But don't worry, I'm going to give you fair warning once we get to that point. Twinless is not a debut, but a sophomore feature for writer-director James Sweeney, and it begins by focusing on Roman, played by Dylan O'Brien. He suffers the untimely and tragic loss of his estranged twin brother Rocky after the latter is hit by a car. Roman ends up attending a support group for twinless twins and strikes up a friendship with a gay man named Dennis, played by writer-director James Sweeney himself. Roman and Dennis bond not only over their shared personal loss, but also the strange rootlessness that is alleged to come from being a twin and no longer having a twin, experiencing a kind of phantom emptiness because you don't have the same inurement that most people just naturally develop to the steady solitude and loneliness of everyday life. You no longer have this person with whom you feel like you shared a heart and a mind in some ways. This person that you grew up with the sense that you were in some way one person, or you always had someone who intimately understood and related to you in a way that nobody else could. Now, obviously, that's a bit of an oversimplification, and it's nice to see as the relationship between Roman and Dennis develops, how Sweeney as a writer really layers on dramatic complexities in our understanding of Roman, especially with regards to how Rocky's coming out of the closet itself proved to be the beginning of its own disconnection between them, its own kind of phantom emptiness preceding Roman's literal loss of his brother. You also get this element of Roman always living in the shadow of Rocky's high achiever status in the family, with Roman being kind of the frustrated black sheep. It's not unlikely that what draws Roman to Dennis specifically is potentially the opportunity to not only have a pseudo-familial companionship with somebody who understands his specific loss, but so he can almost live through Dennis's homosexuality, so he can have the opportunity to treat Dennis and be there for him the way he wishes he had been for Rocky. And what of Dennis? Well, this is the part where I have to warn you, if you keep watching, I have to spoil the movie for you. There is a great first act twist to this story, so if you don't want to be spoiled, if you care about being spoiled, go see Twinless, go see it blind. I'm giving it a 5 out of 5. I think this is a virtually perfect black comedy, psychological drama. I absolutely loved it. Okay, so if you're sticking around, I'm assuming you're ready to hear this. About that serendipity of a double feature, when I decided I was going to see both Lurker and Twinless last Thursday, I had no idea that Twinless was also going to end up being a more psychological kind of drama with the primary character study being this weird parisexual gay stalker? Yes, it turns out Dennis is not a twinless twin. Dennis never even had a twin, but Dennis did have a one-night stand with Rocky and got insanely jealous when Rocky never returned his texts or phone calls, and so he ended up stalking Rocky, which led to him confronting him in broad daylight, making one of those crazy scenes in the East Village that seem to only ever happen in queer movies, but you never get to witness in real life. And so Rocky walks out into the street and confronts Dennis and goes splat when he gets hit by an oncoming car. Dennis ends up wearing a disguise and attending Rocky's funeral, where he sees Roman and then becomes obsessed with him, stalking him, and eventually following him to his support group meeting, where he concocts a whole narrative about being indirectly responsible for the death of his own twin, in a way that even seems to draw upon elements of how he has indirectly been responsible for Rocky's death. It turns out that Dennis is a really, let's say, problematic character. He's not just a compulsive liar, but a conscientious liar. There's even a point in the movie where he straight up reveals that the trick to lying effectively is to include elements that are emotionally true to the person who is lying. And so while Roman is basically playing the big sex-positive gay brother to Dennis, Dennis ends up basically living out a parisexual relationship with Roman, where if Roman is too dumb to be aware of it, he is basically just using him and concocting elaborately further lies and falsehoods so he can pretend to have a boyfriend. Which, of course, doesn't portend good things for either he or Roman in the future, as the latter attends one of Dennis's co-workers' parties and falls head over heels in love with her. There is nothing in Twinless so brutish and perverted and coercive as what happens in Lurker. But if I were to pick the well-acted, well-written, technically exceptional film of this past weekend that was the best one about a weird parisexual gay stalker, I would tell you to see both, because they're two pretty good to great movies that work really well together. They talk to each other, they feed off of one another. But while it's easy to say that Twinless is considerably less stressful because it is in the mold of a quirkier kind of black comedy rather than a full-on psychological drama or thriller, that for me at least would be critically underselling just how stressful Sweeney's film proves to be as a psychological thriller in its own right, and through means that I think are far more subtly ingenious than what Russell in his debut accomplishes with Lurker. Lurker is rather entertainingly sadistic for how Russell is able to play just enough with our sense of sympathy for Matt to toy with our emotions before rending us away from any hope of humanity. But I think Sweeney, as a writer, director, and actor, being accomplished in 3 different ways here, he gets to something even more stressful and downright maddening as the film goes on, because no matter how utterly cracked Dennis is shown to be, it's like Sweeney refuses to relent from the idea that Dennis still is, or at least can be, a sympathetic character study. That no matter how far gone he is in terms of his pathological lying, his impulsive behavior, his obsession and manipulation of others, for Sweeney in all 3 of these roles, the admirable challenge seems to be to portray this character, this weird gay stalker, as sympathetic in a kind of archetypal way. Lurker is a solid movie and an exceptional and entertainingly cathartic debut, but it only works as a satire in the most superficial terms of the very subject that Russell is satirizing. Twinless, on the other hand, uses the conceit of the twinless twin only as a fulcrum, and a more original one at that, for dealing with the undergirding theme of profound loneliness, the profound search for total validation in companionship with another person, preferably an idealized object in your own head. Russell quite successfully tells the most morbid but simplistic tale he can with the most obvious problematic elements of our popular culture in its current engagement farming, social media, short-form slop mold. Whereas I think Sweeney is actually able to describe the undercurrent of that surface-level culture. He's able to tap into the sort of rootlessness, the wanting, the starvation of true intimacy that can turn people into characters filmmakers like Matt and Dennis, people who are willing to do and say anything to build just as much of a flimsy edifice of what they think life is supposed to be like, to fill in that gaping, gnawing hole of feeling like, in the words of Thomas Wolfe, that loneliness is the central and inevitable fact of their existence. Sweeney portrays Dennis doing demonstrably terrible, selfish things, but he's not as quick as so many filmmakers would be to pathologize this character, because ultimately, Twinless is a movie about how desperate the need for companionship can sometimes be, and ultimately, while Dennis's stories to Roman are full of falsehoods, his affect full of deceit, there is a chemistry between them, because Roman sees something real in Dennis, and Dennis proves reliable and caring and sensitive and open to Roman's needs, and not just selfishly pursuing his own or extracting from Roman. It helps that Sweeney is also a genuinely good comedy writer, if more in that situational and quirky cosmopolitan way than that gag mold. But I had such a powerfully positive experience with Twinless because I realized that here was a work of intuitive cinematic art doing exactly what the rather similar movie before it did not, which was to not continue to view the problems of our alienated and atomized society as a function of some amorphous, contagious pathology that turns people into selfish, avaricious monsters, but to rather render the problem as loneliness, as the lack of social adjustment and intimacy, whether platonic or sexual, as the very clear need for companionship that we have as social animals that our society is deleteriously incapable of meeting for so many people, especially the younger they are and the more plugged in they are to that matrix of false, parasocial, downright parasexual companionship. I mean, honestly, what would be the worse or harder to address thing that we discovered? That our current society, including our pop culture, is turning everybody into psychopaths, or that it's only making people act more like how we think psychopaths would act because everybody is so lonely and so desperate that they feel like they need to lie, they need to deceive, they need to present false versions of themselves to appease the particular parasocial needs and desires they see in others. They need to follow, they need to obsess, they need to make their life about and cling on to the thin scraps that they get, because deep down we really are mostly normal people with normal desires for companionship and intimacy, with normal regrets and feelings of shame, with normal desires to feel not validated by an audience, but needed by another human being, because maybe, just maybe, at a baseline, most of us aren't only out for ourselves. Maybe we really do need to feel like our lives are in service of something greater, even if it's just one person. If I can put it in the most simplest way possible, in a movie like Lurker, all of Dennis's same behaviors are framed in pathological terms, as if they, just by saying things certain ways and doing things certain ways, this is just Matt demonstrating for us that he is this psychological construct, this psychopath, rather than a character. Whereas with James Sweeney's crafting of Dennis, we get to see a version of this character where we're like, oh, right, sometimes people's bad behaviors are maladaptive coping mechanisms that they've developed because they don't see there being any other options. Right. People aren't necessarily defined by single moments or episodes in their lives. They have greater complexities, and their actions are not necessarily reflections on their essence as like the difference between a human being and some human monster, but are reflections of their experiences and how they've coped with those experiences. Maybe there's a bit of a reciprocal paradox with Lurker getting a little bit of the sheen taken off it by Twinless, or Twinless just looking way better because of what came before it, but I'm prepared to say that Twinless not only is one of my favorite movies I've seen all year, but solidly in the running for my favorite movie of the year, period. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.